My name is Audrey Prescott, and I am 32 years old. Exactly 15 minutes ago, I stood in my parents' high-ceilinged kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching my mother polish a silver gravy boat that cost more than her first car. It was in that moment, as the afternoon sun hit the brick patio outside, that she looked at me with a weary, thin-lipped expression and called me a financial burden. "We've tried to be supportive, Audrey," my mother Lydia said, her voice carrying that sharp, aristocratic edge she uses when she's about to cut someone down to size. "But your father and I are looking at our retirement, and we can't keep accounting for a daughter who has no ambition. Your brother, Colton, is out there fighting to get his real estate empire off the ground. And you're just a weight we've been dragging along since graduation. It's exhausting to keep carrying you." My father, Silas, didn't even look up from the financial section of the newspaper. He just turned the page, the dry crinkle of the paper sounding like a final verdict. Colton, my 34-year-old golden child brother, leaned against the marble island, checking his reflection in his darkened phone screen. He had just lost his third investment property to foreclosure last month, yet in this house, he was the visionary leader, and I was the drain on resources. The irony felt like a physical weight in my lungs. For years, I had played the role of the struggling office worker perfectly. I wore the same 3 sweaters, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and never corrected them when they assumed my salary barely covered my rent. They saw me as a burden? Me? The person who had quietly paid the $12,000 property tax bill on this very house last November? The person who had anonymously funded Silas's heart surgery 2 years ago through a community grant that didn't actually exist? They had no idea that while they saw a clerk, the corporate world in Raleigh knew me as the senior director of acquisitions for one of the largest firms in the Southeast. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. For a decade, I had swallowed their disappointment along with their Sunday roasts, hoping that if I just provided enough safety nets, they would eventually notice the hands that were catching them. But standing there, watching Lydia polish silver I had paid for, I realized you cannot be seen by people who find it more profitable to keep you invisible. Before I tell you how I turned that Sunday afternoon into the day my family's comfortable lie finally collapsed, do me a small kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the story reach more people who might be going through the same thing. Drop a comment below and let me know which city you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to the moment I stopped being fine and started being the storm they never saw coming. The dining room in our Charlotte home was a masterpiece of curated lies. My mother, Lydia, had spent decades perfecting the aesthetic of old money success, even when the bank accounts beneath the surface were screaming in the red. The brass chandelier hung low over the mahogany table, casting a warm, deceptive glow on the heavy lace tablecloth and the silver-rimmed china. The smell of slow-roasted beef and rosemary filled the air, a scent that usually signals comfort, but in this house, it always smelled like a trap. I sat in my usual spot, the chair furthest from the head of the table, feeling the familiar weight of being the invisible daughter. Across from me sat Colton, leaning back with an air of unearned confidence that only a golden child can pull off. He was 34, wearing a crisp linen shirt and a watch that I knew for a fact he'd bought with a credit card that was currently over its limit. He was busy recounting his latest revolutionary idea, a luxury condo flip in a neighborhood that hadn't even been zoned for residential use yet. "It's about vision, Dad," Colton said, gesturing broadly with his wine glass. "The market in North Carolina is exploding. If I get in now, I'm looking at a 300% return by Q4. I just need a little more liquidity to bridge the gap between the down payment and the construction loan." My father, Silas, nodded with a solemnity usually reserved for a state funeral. He looked at Colton with a pride that he had never once directed toward me, despite the fact that I had actually graduated top of my class and held a steady, high-ranking executive position. To Silas, Colton's failures were just growing pains of a great man, while my successes were merely expected clerical duties. "Vision is expensive, son," Silas said, his voice thick with a forced ruggedness. But it's the only thing that builds a legacy. Real men take risks. They don't just sit in cubicles counting other people's money. He shot a pointed look at me. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of roast beef with surgical precision. I could have told them right then that the neighborhood Colton was eyeing was a toxic brownfield site. I could have told them that his construction loan was actually a high-interest predatory debt from a firm my company had blacklisted 3 months ago. But I had learned long ago that in this room, facts were less valuable than Colton's fantasies. Lydia reached out and patted Colton's hand, her diamonds catching the light. Then the air in the room shifted. I felt the temperature drop before she even spoke. She turned her gaze to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Audrey, dear," she began, her voice sliding across the table like the gravy, thick, salty, and impossible to ignore. "Your brother is so close to a breakthrough. He's working so hard for this family's name. And we were thinking, since you have that steady little paycheck and your expenses are so low in that modest apartment of yours, perhaps you could help bridge that liquidity gap. It's only $50,000. For someone with no real responsibilities like you, it should be a simple transfer." I set my fork down. The clink of silver against china sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. $50,000. They wanted me to hand over $50,000 to fund another one of Colton's delusions. They thought my modest apartment was because I was struggling, not because I was smart with my investments. They thought my steady little paycheck was the ceiling of my worth. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice the temperature of an ice bath, "I don't have $50,000 just lying around for a real estate flip that hasn't even cleared a title search." Silas's face went a dark shade of mahogany. "Don't be difficult, Audrey. This isn't about the money. It's about family loyalty. Your brother is trying to build something. You're just existing. You live like a hermit. You drive that old car, and you barely contribute to the household expenses when you visit. We've been carrying the emotional burden of your lack of ambition for years. The least you can do is support the one person in this family who actually has a future." "A burden," I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "Yes, a burden," Lydia whispered, leaning in. "It's exhausting, Audrey, constantly worrying if you're ever going to be more than just a clerk, constantly having to explain to our friends why our daughter is so unremarkable compared to her brother. We love you, honey, but you are a weight on this family's progress." The irony was a physical ache in my chest. I looked at the three of them. The mother who wore jewelry I had quietly insured, the father whose medical bills I had cleared, and the brother who was currently wearing a shirt I had indirectly paid for through the allowance I sent my parents. They were standing on my shoulders while shouting down at me for being too short. Before I tell you about the bank statement I was about to drop on this table like a hand grenade, do me a favor, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribed. This story is about to get very real, and I don't want you to miss the moment the locks finally changed. Drop a stay strong in the comments if you've ever been the one holding your family together while they called you the problem. Now, back to that dinner in Charlotte, where the pot roast was cold and my patience was officially dead. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked at Silas and said, "If I'm such a weight, Dad, maybe it's time I stopped leaning on you." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Leaning on us? Audrey, you wouldn't last a week without the safety net this family provides. Now, are you going to help your brother, or are we going to have to remind you where you came from?" I stood up, leaving my napkin on the chair. "I think you've reminded me quite enough for one lifetime." The drive away from my parents' house was always the same, a long, silent tunnel of Charlotte's oak-lined streets that felt more like a cage than a neighborhood. But this time, the word burden was echoing in the car, bouncing off the dashboard and settling in my throat like ash. I pulled into a quiet parking lot near a park, the engine idling, and I just sat there. You know that feeling? When a single word acts like a key, unlocking a door you've spent 15 years trying to keep bolted shut? That was me in that moment. Let me tell you about the math in the Prescott family, because in our house, the math was always rigged. If you've ever been the reliable child while your sibling was the visionary, you know exactly the kind of tiredness I'm describing. It isn't just physical. It's a soul-deep exhaustion from constantly being the foundation that everyone else stands on while they complain that you're too flat. It started when we were kids. I remember being 8 years old, coming home with a perfect score on a statewide math assessment. I was buzzing, my little hands shaking with the paper as I ran into the kitchen. My mother, Lydia, was busy sewing a patch onto Colton's Little League jersey. She didn't even look at my paper. She just glanced at the A+ and said, "That's lovely, Audrey. Did Colton help you with your homework last night? He's so good at leading others." Colton was 12. He was in the den, failing pre-algebra and throwing a tantrum because he didn't want to practice his swing. He hadn't helped me with a single thing in my life, yet in her mind, my success had to be a reflection of his leadership. That was the blueprint for our lives. Colton was the sun, and I was just the moon, only allowed to shine if I reflected his light. By the time we hit high school, the gap became a canyon. For Colton's 16th birthday, my father, Silas, bought him a brand new silver Ford F-150. It sat in the driveway, gleaming under the North Carolina sun, a $40,000 gift for a boy who had barely managed a 2.0 GPA. When my 16th birthday rolled around 6 months later, I got a bus pass and a speech about the value of hard work and independence. "We want you to be self-sufficient, Audrey," Silas had told me, not looking up from his paper. "A girl with your steady nature needs to learn the grit of the real world. Colton needs the truck for his social standing. He's a natural-born networker." So I worked. I spent my summers at a greasy diner on the edge of town, smelling like old fries and floor wax, saving every nickel. I paid for my own school supplies, my own prom dress, and eventually the $1,200 clunker of a car that leaked oil every time I turned a corner. While I was scrubbing tables, Colton was spending my parents' money on networking events, which were really just beach trips and parties where he convinced Silas he was building a real estate mindset. Before I get to the part where they emptied their entire retirement for a lie, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. If you've ever felt like the invisible child in your own home, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Was there a Colton in your life? I read every single one of your comments because it reminds me that I wasn't alone in that hallway closet of a life. Now, let's talk about the college years. The moment the burden label was officially engraved. The year I graduated high school, I had acceptance letters from 3 top-tier universities. I had the grades, the extracurriculars, and the drive. But when I sat my parents down to talk about the tuition, the room went ice cold. "Audrey, honey," Lydia said, her voice dropping into that staged, concerned tone. "We've had a talk. We've decided to put our resources behind Colton's MBA. He's going to an Ivy League school. It's an investment in the Prescott legacy. You're so practical. You can go to the state school down the road. You'll find a way to make it work. You always do." They didn't just give him a tuition check. They emptied their 401k. They took out a second mortgage. They gave him $150,000 for a business education that he mostly spent in bars and at high-stakes poker games in dorm rooms. I, the practical one, went to the state school. I worked 3 jobs, tutoring in the mornings, office temping in the afternoons, and bartending until 2 a.m. I lived on ramen and caffeine, graduating in 4 years with a finance degree and 0 help from home. The day I graduated, my parents arrived 40 minutes late. There was no party for me. There was no, "We have a graduate announcement at the church coffee hour." 2 weeks later, when Colton dropped out of his MBA program with a revolutionary startup idea and a $60,000 credit card debt, my mother held a dinner for him to celebrate his courage to follow his own path. I remember sitting at that dinner, the same mahogany table from earlier, watching them toast to his vision while he was literally bankrupting them. I was 22, staring at the $40,000 in student loans I had just taken on myself, and I realized something that changed me forever. The child who is never praised doesn't stop loving. They just stop hoping. They start measuring their worth in quieter things: spreadsheets, early mornings, the weight of a savings account that no one else knows exists. I stopped asking for their pride. I moved into a tiny, drafty studio apartment in Raleigh and took an entry-level job at an acquisitions firm. I told them I was a clerk. It was easier that way. If they thought I was struggling, they left me alone. If they knew I was succeeding, they would have found a way to turn my success into a lifeline for Colton. But even then, I couldn't completely cut them off. That's the curse of the reliable child. When Silas needed heart surgery 2 years ago and the insurance had gaps, I was the one who called the hospital and anonymously cleared the $12,000 balance. When the property taxes on their house were 6 months overdue because Colton had borrowed the tax money for a crypto scam, I was the one who wired the funds through a third-party lawyer, making it look like a government relief grant. I did all of that while driving my 10-year-old sedan, wearing the same 3 work blazers I'd bought on sale, and listening to them tell their friends that Audrey is doing okay, we suppose. She's just a burden on our peace of mind, always so gloomy and uninspired. Not like Colton. I had spent 15 years being a ghost, a silent benefactor, a safety net they didn't even know was catching them. And standing there in that parking lot in Charlotte, 15 minutes after being called a wait, I realized that a safety net only works if it stays below the person. If you move it, they fall. And I was done catching people who were busy spitting on me from above. I looked at my phone. I had 3 missed calls from my office. A multi-million-dollar merger was closing in 48 hours, and I was the lead director. The corporate world saw a powerhouse. My family saw a clerk. It was time for those 2 worlds to collide. The Monday morning after that dinner didn't start with a breakdown. It started with a 5 a.m. alarm and the cold, mechanical precision of a woman who had learned that the only person coming to save her was herself. I drove my 10-year-old sedan out of the shadows of my parents' neighborhood in Charlotte, watching the silver-rimmed houses fade in my rearview mirror. To Silas and Lydia, I was heading to a clerk's desk at some nameless firm, where I likely spent my day stapling papers and hoping for a cost-of-living raise. But about 6 miles downtown, I pulled into a private parking garage under a glass and steel skyscraper that glowed like a beacon in the early morning fog. I didn't park in the guest lot. I swiped a black executive badge and parked in a reserved spot that didn't have my name on it, only a title, Senior Director of Acquisitions. I swapped my sensible driving shoes for a pair of black designer pumps I kept in the trunk, the kind of shoes my mother would have called frivolous if she knew they cost more than her dining room table. I walked through the lobby, where the security guards nodded and used my last name with a tone of genuine respect. In this building, I wasn't a burden. I wasn't the unremarkable daughter. I was the person who signed the checks that kept this entire floor running. I sat down at my mahogany desk, overlooking the Charlotte skyline, and let the silence of the 34th floor wash over me. My assistant, a sharp young man named Marcus, brought in my first cup of coffee and a thick stack of due diligence reports. "Good morning, Ms. Prescott," he said, setting the reports down. "The merger for the hospitality group in Raleigh is ready for your final signature. Also, that private inquiry you made about the property tax records for Sycamore Lane, the payment went through. The county has marked the account as current under the anonymous trust you set up." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "Has the insurance provider confirmed the premium update for the heart recovery policy?" "Yes, ma'am." "The supplementary coverage for Silas Prescott has been active since the 1st of the month. As far as the provider is concerned, it's a standard employee benefit extension from an anonymous corporate donor." I nodded, and he left. I sat there for a long time, looking at that tax receipt. $12,000. That was the liquidity gap my parents were facing last winter because Colton had convinced them to invest their property tax money into a high-yield crypto fund that vanished in 3 weeks. They had been weeks away from a foreclosure notice, panicking in that kitchen, until a government relief grant magically arrived in their mailbox. They had cried with relief, telling everyone at church that God was looking out for them. Silas had even toasted Colton that night, saying, "I think your positive energy and vision brought this luck into our house, son." I had sat at the end of the table, sipping water, knowing that the luck was actually my bonus check from the third quarter. I had saved their home, and in return, I got to listen to my father tell me I should be more like my brother. It's a strange thing, living a double life. Most people do it to hide a vice or a secret affair. I did it to protect my peace. I knew that if Silas and Lydia knew I was earning mid-six figures, my life would no longer be mine. I would become the permanent bank for Colton's startups. Every time he crashed a car or defaulted on a loan, I would be expected to do the right thing for family. By pretending to be struggling, I had bought myself a decade of freedom, or so I thought. Here is the truth about the burden label. They didn't call me a burden because I took from them. They called me a burden because I stopped being useful in the way they wanted. Because I wouldn't hand over $50,000 for a condo flip that was clearly a scam, I was suddenly a weight. Let's talk about the math of Silas's heart surgery 2 years ago. The insurance had a massive gap, the kind that makes you choose between a house and your health. My parents were terrified. I remember Lydia sitting on the porch, her face pale, whispering about how they might have to move into a smaller apartment. "Don't worry, Mom," Colton had said, patting her hand. "I'm working on a big deal. The money will be here." The big deal never happened. But the hospital bill was paid. I had spent 4 nights in the waiting room, working on my laptop until 3 a.m., coordinating with a fiduciary lawyer to ensure the funds reached the hospital without a trace. When the billing department told Silas he was covered under a special philanthropic fund, he looked at Colton and said, "See, Audrey, your brother's connections in the business world must have made this happen. Visionaries have friends in high places." I didn't correct him. I just went back to work. But standing there in my office on Monday morning, looking at the city I had quietly helped build, I realized the cost of my silence. I had allowed them to believe a lie, and in that lie, they had grown to hate the very person who was keeping them afloat. I had played the role of the invisible safety net for so long that they actually believed they were flying on their own. Before I tell you about the bank statement I was currently printing out, the one that was going to change the temperature of that house forever, do me a small kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to me. Drop a truth in the comments if you've ever been the one paying for the party while everyone else took the credit. Your stories are the reason I'm finally speaking up. Now, back to the office in Charlotte, where I was about to stop being a ghost. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer. It's Audrey Prescott. I want to dissolve the anonymity of the Sycamore Lane Trust. Effective immediately, all payments for the property taxes and medical supplements are to be paused. If they ask who was paying, tell them. If they want to know why it stopped, tell them I've decided to stop being a burden. There was a pause on the other end. Audrey, you know this will likely trigger a financial crisis for them within 90 days. I know, I said, looking at a framed photo on my desk. Not of my family, but of the day I bought my own penthouse with cash. But they've been telling me I'm a weight. I think it's time they feel how light the air is without me underneath them. I hung up. I didn't feel the guilt I expected. I felt a strange, humming energy in my limbs. For years, I had been the steady one, the reliable one, the invisible one. But as I watched the printer spit out 5 years of wire transfers, tax payments, and hospital receipts, I realized that I wasn't just a burden. I was the foundation, and I was about to walk out from under the house. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. In my world, 48 hours is the time it takes to finalize a hostile takeover or restructure a failing REIT. In my family's world, 48 hours was the time it took for the first financial domino to fall. They didn't call because they missed me. They didn't call because they felt bad about the burden comment. They called because for the first time in 15 years, the invisible safety net I had built beneath them had suddenly vanished, and they were beginning to feel the height of the fall. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone lit up with 12 missed calls from my mother, Lydia, and a string of frantic texts from Colton. I sat in my penthouse overlooking the Charlotte skyline, a glass of expensive Cabernet in one hand and my professional leather portfolio in the other. I didn't answer. I wanted the cold reality of their bank balances to settle in. I wanted them to look at the past due notices that were no longer being intercepted by my lawyers. Finally, I drove to the house on Sycamore Lane one last time. I didn't take my old sedan. I took my black executive SUV, the one I usually kept for meetings with investors. I parked it right in the center of the driveway, blocking Colton's flashy sports car. When I walked through the front door, the air in the house felt different. It didn't smell like rosemary and lies anymore. It smelled like panic. Lydia was pacing the hallway, her phone clutched to her ear, while my father, Silas, sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers that looked like they had been hit by a storm. Colton was leaning against the counter, looking less like a visionary leader and more like a man who had just seen his shadow for the first time. "Audrey." "Thank God you're here," Lydia exclaimed, rushing toward me. She didn't hug me. She reached for my arm as if I were a life raft. "Everything is going wrong. The county sent a notice saying our property taxes were never paid, and Silas's supplementary insurance. The provider called and said the philanthropic grant has been terminated. They want $6,000 by Friday or his coverage lapses. And my bridge loan," Colton chimed in, his voice cracking. "The firm I was working with, they just sent a cease and desist. They said my credit profile was reevaluated and found to be fraudulent. Audrey, you have to help. You have that steady job. You must have some savings. We're family, right? You can't let us lose the house." I didn't say a word. I walked to the kitchen table, moved a bowl of decorative lemons, and laid my leather portfolio down. I unzipped it slowly. The sound of the zipper was the only noise in the room. "You called me a burden, Mom," I said, my voice as flat and cold as a marble grave. "You told me I was a weight on this family's progress. You said I was unremarkable compared to Colton's vision." "Oh, Audrey, we were just frustrated." Lydia waved her hand dismissively, the diamonds on her fingers flashing in the light. "Families say things. But this is an emergency. We need $50,000 for Colton's deal and another $20,000 for the house and the insurance. We'll pay you back, obviously." "No, you won't," I said. I pulled out the first document. It was a wire transfer log from my private account. "This is the property tax receipt for last year. $12,000. Paid by me. Not a government grant. Me." I slid the paper across the table. Silas picked it up, his hand shaking. "This is the supplement for your heart surgery, Dad," I continued, sliding the next page. $47,000 over 2 years. Paid by me. Through a fiduciary trust I set up to keep you from feeling beholden to a daughter you didn't respect. The room went tomb quiet. Lydia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Colton reached for the papers, his eyes scanning the numbers like they were a foreign language. "And this," I said, pulling out a final sheet of paper with the corporate letterhead of my firm, "is my business card. I am not a clerk, Silas. I am the senior director of acquisitions at the firm that just blacklisted Colton's real estate deal. I didn't blacklist him because I was petty. I blacklisted him because I ran a due diligence report and found that he's been gambling away your retirement money for 3 years. "That's a lie," Colton shouted, but his face had gone the color of spoiled milk. "Is it?" I asked. I pulled out the last set of attachments. "These are the withdrawals from your joint home equity line. 68 separate transfers to an offshore sports book, totaling $94,000. He didn't lose your money to a bad market, Mom. He lost it on the NFL playoffs." Lydia turned to look at Colton. The look on her face wasn't the favorite child smile anymore. It was the look of a woman who had finally realized she had been worshiping a false god while the real power was sitting at the end of the table being ignored. "Audrey," Silas whispered, looking at the business card and then at me. "We didn't know. Why didn't you tell us?" "Because in this house, the truth only matters if it has a price tag," I replied. "I wanted to be a daughter. I wanted you to be proud of me because I was Audrey, not because I was a senior director. But you made it clear that my only value was how much I could be used. And when I stopped being a convenient source of cash for Colton's failures, I became a burden. Before I tell you what my mother did next, the way her voice shifted from burden to our sweet daughter in the space of a single breath, do me a small kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It means everything to me to have you here. Drop a respect in the comments if you've ever had to show your receipts to people who didn't believe in you. Now let's get back to that kitchen in Charlotte, where the visionary was finally exposed. Lydia stepped toward me, her eyes filling with tears that I knew were performance. Audrey, honey, we are so proud of you. Senior Director, we always knew you had it in you. We just wanted to push you to your full potential. And now that we know you're doing so well, surely you can handle these little bills? I mean, for someone in your position, $70,000 is nothing. It's for your father's health. It's for our home. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had sold my childhood piano to pay for Colton's science camp. I looked at the woman who had called me a wait 48 hours ago. The payments have already been stopped, I said, zipping up my portfolio. The trust is dissolved. The property tax is now your responsibility. And as for the insurance, Dad, you have 30 days to find a marketplace plan. I've already sent a guide to your email. I suggest you read it. It's the first thing I'm not doing for you. You can't do this, Colton screamed, stepping toward me. You're destroying this family. No, Colton, I said, standing my ground. You destroyed this family. I just stopped paying for the wreckage. If I'm a burden, then I'm taking that burden and walking out of this house. You have your vision, Colton. Use it to pay the mortgage. And Mom, if you want to know why I'm doing this, just remember what you said across the pot roast. We can't keep accounting for a daughter who has no ambition. Well, I have plenty of ambition. It's just no longer focused on saving you from yourselves. I turned and walked toward the door. I could hear Lydia starting to sob. I could hear Silas calling my name, his voice finally sounding old. But I didn't stop. As I reached the front door, I turned back one last time. By the way, I'm changing my phone number tomorrow. If you want to talk to me, you can call my office. But I should warn you, my assistant is very good at screening out unremarkable people. I walked out to my SUV, the heavy thud of the door closing feeling like the final beat of a long, painful heart. I drove away from Sycamore Lane, and for the first time in my entire life, the air in Charlotte didn't feel heavy. It felt like freedom. I drove through the dark, canopy-lined streets of Charlotte, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The silence in the SUV was a stark contrast to the screaming and sobbing I had left behind at Sycamore Lane. For 15 years, I had been the person who absorbed their noise. I was the sponge for their disappointment, the silent bank for their failures, and the ghost that kept their world from collapsing. But as I pulled into the underground parking of my penthouse building, I realized that I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was solid. I was real. And for the first time in my life, I was loud, even in my silence. I walked into my penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city lights. This was the home they didn't know I owned. This was the life they called unremarkable. I poured myself a glass of water and set my phone on the kitchen island. Almost immediately, it began to vibrate. It didn't just ring, it screamed. Lydia was first, then Silas, then a flurry of texts from Colton that oscillated between begging and threats. I watched the screen light up over and over again. My mother's caller ID flashed. Mom. I thought about all the times that name on the screen had made my stomach drop. All the times I had answered on the first ring because I was afraid of being difficult. I looked at the phone and felt nothing. The cord hadn't just been cut, it had been incinerated. By 10 p.m., the flying monkeys started. If you've ever stood up to a toxic family, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The relatives who haven't called you in 3 years suddenly find your number to tell you that blood is blood and you're being too harsh. My Aunt Beatrice called twice. My Uncle Greg, the one whose medical bills I had also quietly helped with, sent a 3-paragraph essay about the sanctity of family. Audrey, your mother is in hysterics, Beatrice's voicemail said, her voice dripping with that staged Southern concern. She says you've cut off your father's heart medicine. Honey, you can't be that cold. Your brother is just a dreamer. You know how he is. Don't let money destroy this family." I listened to the message twice. I didn't cry. I just thought about how Beatrice hadn't mentioned the burden comment. She hadn't mentioned Colton's gambling. She only mentioned the money. Because in my family, the only time you're a burden is when you're not a bank. Before I tell you about the phone call I finally answered, the one that forced me to call a locksmith at midnight, do me a small kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the story reach more people. Have you ever dealt with flying monkeys in your family? Tell me about it below. I'm reading every word. Now, back to the night the locks changed. At 11:30 p.m., my father called. I answered because I wanted to see if there was a single shred of dad left in the man who had packed my childhood into a box. "Audrey," he said, his voice rough. "The bank just sent an automated alert. The mortgage portal shows the payment was canceled. The taxes are delinquent. Your mother hasn't stopped crying." "I told you I was stopping the payments, Silas," I said. "I gave you 30 days of notice in that kitchen. I'm just starting the clock early." "You can't do this to us," he whispered. "We're your parents. We gave you everything." "You gave me a folding chair and a bus pass," I replied. "And I gave you a roof, a heart surgery, and a reputation. I think the ledger is more than balanced. If Colton has vision, tell him to go find the money. He's the favorite, remember? Surely his empire can handle a mortgage." "You're a selfish, bitter girl," he spat, the mask finally slipping. "You've always been jealous of your brother's spirit. You think because you have a fancy title, you can look down on us? You're still just the unremarkable girl we had to carry for 30 years. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, the city lights reflecting in my glass of water. I realized then that they would never see me. Not even if I bought them the moon. To them, I was a utility, like the electricity or the water. You don't thank the light switch for working. You only get angry when the lights go out. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called a locksmith. A man named Dale arrived at my penthouse at 9 a.m. He was a quiet professional. He looked at the heavy designer door of my apartment and then at me. "Just the main entrance, ma'am?" he asked. "The main entrance, the service door, and I need a new security code for the private elevator," I said. "I want the old keys to be completely useless." I watched him work. I watched the brass tumblers fall. I watched him drill into the frame with a high, thin sound that reminded me of the screws my father used to seal my room when I was younger. Every turn of his screwdriver felt like a stitch in a wound that was finally being closed. While Dale was working, my mother appeared at the lobby downstairs. The concierge called me, his voice hesitant. "Miss Prescott, a woman named Lydia is here. She says she's your mother, and she's insisting on coming up. She says she has a key. She has an old key," I told him. "And no, she is not authorized. From this moment on, no one with the name Prescott is allowed past the front desk without a written invitation from me. If she causes a scene, call the police." I hung up. 10 minutes later, I saw her from my balcony. She was standing on the sidewalk in the Charlotte heat, clutching her designer purse and looking up at the glass towers. She looked small. For the first time, she didn't look like the giant who had dictated my self-worth. She looked like a woman who had realized she had burned the only bridge that led to her survival. Dale handed me 3 new brass keys. They were heavy and sharp-edged. "Here you go, ma'am. These are high security. No one is getting in without your permission." I paid him, shook his hand, and closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a boundary being formalized. It was the sound of the burden finally putting the weight down. But the fallout wasn't just about locks. It was about the narrative. Over the next week, the stories started circulating in our social circles. Lydia was telling everyone at the country club that I had stolen money from the family and left them homeless. Silas was telling his old work buddies that his heart was failing because of the stress his ungrateful daughter was causing him. I received an email from the hospital foundation director, Helena. Audrey, I'm getting calls from people asking about Silas's insurance. They're saying you're refusing to help your own father with his recovery. Do you want to issue a statement? I sat at my desk and wrote back, the only statement I have is the bank records. If they want to know why I stopped paying, ask them about the $94,000 Colton gambled away. I'm no longer in the business of funding lies. That was the hardest part, the realization that when you stop being a safety net, people don't congratulate you for your strength. They punish you for their inconvenience. My family didn't miss me. They missed my compliance. They missed my silence. They missed the version of Audrey who would apologize for their mistakes. On Friday afternoon, I sat in my office and finalized the paperwork to move my firm's headquarters. I was moving to the Austin office. I needed more than just new locks. I needed a new zip code. I needed to be in a city where the name Prescott didn't carry the weight of 1,000 unearned expectations. Before I left, I sent one final text to the family group chat. I didn't wait for a reply. I just sent it and then deleted the app. I have spent 15 years being your ghost. I have paid for your lives, your health, and your failures. You called me a burden. I have finally accepted that title. I am now a burden you no longer have to carry because I am gone. Do not call Beatrice. Do not call Greg. The bank has the house records. Colton has the vision. I have the key. Goodbye. I walked out of my office, past the team that respected me, and headed toward the airport. As the plane lifted off over the North Carolina coast, I looked down at the shrinking city. I thought about the unremarkable girl who had sat at that mahogany table and swallowed her roast beef in silence. I whispered to her, "It's okay. You can breathe now. The door is locked." It has been 6 months since that rainy Sunday in Charlotte, the day the word burden finally stopped being a weight and started being a compass. I am sitting on the balcony of my new home, watching the sunset over a city where nobody knows my history, nobody expects me to be their safety net, and nobody calls me invisible. The air here feels lighter, not because I am doing less, but because I am no longer carrying the crushing expectations of people who only valued me as a utility. I have learned that boundaries are not walls built out of hate. They are fences with gates, and for the first time in my 32 years, I have kept the key on my own ring. My family didn't need me to be patient or quiet or fine. They needed me to be honest. But honesty is a language that people like Silas and Lydia rarely speak unless they are forced to read the receipts. The hardest part of this journey wasn't changing the locks or even the 30-day notices. It was the realization that the reliable child is rarely thanked on time. They are only thanked late, and even then it's usually because the bank account is empty. I realized that I had spent a decade trying to buy a seat at a table where I was never actually welcome as a daughter, only as a benefactor. Now, my Sunday mornings are different. I drink my coffee in silence before I even look at my phone. I've made it a rule. 8 minutes of peace for myself before the world or my past can ask for a single second of my time. My mother still sends the occasional text, messages that swing between "I miss you" and "the roof is leaking." I read them, I stir my coffee, and I don't feel the old panic in my chest. I have realized that I didn't become a bad daughter. I simply became a daughter who could afford to be herself. To everyone watching this, do not wait for your family to recognize your worth. Do not wait for a particular dinner where everything finally becomes clear. Those dinners do not exist in the real world. If you are the one holding everything together while no one notices, I want you to know that you are allowed to stop. Stopping isn't betrayal, it's self-respect. Before we close this chapter, I want to hear from you. What would you name the room you reclaimed for yourself? Leave your first name and your city in the comments. Thank you for sitting at my table today and for finishing this story with me. We are the ones who write the final paragraphs, and today, my story is finally mine. Hit that like button and subscribe if this helped you find your voice. It is a Tuesday morning in Austin, and the light coming through my office window is that bright gold you only find in the Texas Hill Country. My name is Audrey Prescott, and a year ago, I was a ghost in Charlotte. Today, I am the lead partner in a firm that bears my name, sitting in an office with 12 people who look at me with respect, not because of what I can give them, but because of what we build together. For the first 6 months after the lock change, the silence was a heavy thing. I didn't return calls. I didn't check the family group chat. I simply focused on the math, the spreadsheets of a new life that finally added up to zero drama. But time is the only auditor that never makes a mistake. Eventually, the reports from back home started trickling in, mostly through my Aunt Patty, who had decided that being a silent observer to my family's dysfunction was no longer a role she could stomach. The house on Sycamore Lane, the one my mother, Lydia, treated like a palace, had undergone a transformation. When the bank finally issued the 60-day delinquency warning, Lydia and Silas realized that Vision didn't pay property taxes. They didn't sell the house. Instead, they had to do something that Lydia considered a fate worse than death. They took in a renter. A graduate student from the local university now lives in the upstairs suite, my old room. Lydia spends her days cooking in a kitchen that is no longer entirely hers, sharing the hallway with a stranger who pays the mortgage I used to cover in secret. And then there is Colton. My golden child brother, the man of 1,000 empires, finally hit the one wall he couldn't charm his way through. Without my credit to back his loans, the silver sports car was repossessed from the driveway while the neighbors watched. Aunt Patty told me he rode with Lydia to the grocery store for 3 months because he couldn't afford the insurance on a moped. He eventually found a job at a garden supply center. It isn't a real estate empire, and there are no condo flips in his future, but for the first time in his 34 years, he is earning a paycheck with his own name on it. He hasn't quit yet, which is the closest thing to a miracle our family has ever seen. I received a letter from my mother 3 months ago. It wasn't an email. Her handwriting looked thin, almost fragile. "Audrey," it began. "I went to the bank last week. I asked the young man at the desk to explain the last 5 years of statements to me. I saw the transfers. I saw the dates. I saw everything you did while we were telling you that you weren't enough." She didn't apologize in the first paragraph. She just stated the facts. She told me Silas's heart is stable, but he spends most of his time on the porch now. She told me that she had painted over the guest room, the room Colton moved back into after his car was taken. She had painted it a dull, neutral color, like a hospital hallway. "I didn't raise you well," she wrote. "I wanted a son who was a visionary, and I wanted it so hard that I couldn't see the daughter I already had. Your father says I made you into a ghost in your own house. He finally said that to me last Tuesday. It's the longest sentence he's spoken in a decade." I read that letter at my desk in Austin, and for the first time in a year, I didn't feel anger. I just felt finished. I didn't call her back that day, but I sent a bouquet of rosemary and sage to the house on Sycamore Lane. No card, just the herbs. Sage survives anything, and rosemary is for remembrance. Before I tell you about the one call I finally did take, the one from my father, do me a small kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are so close to our next goal, and having you here means the world to me. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a family member realize your worth only after you were gone? Silas called me on a Tuesday afternoon in August. I was between meetings, looking out at the Texas sun. I answered on the second ring. "Audrey," he said. His voice was rough. "Hi, Dad." "I saw the sign," he said. "Patty sent me a photo of your office in Austin, Sinclair and Prescott. You're the lead partner." "I am. I didn't know because I didn't ask," he whispered. "That's on me. I watched your mother build a world on your back, and I got so comfortable I forgot you were underneath. That's not love, Audrey. That's furniture." I stood at the window and watched a small sailboat on the lake in the distance. "We can talk, Dad, but the money stays off the table. No guilt, no joint accounts, no Colton. Just us." "Understood," he said. He had never used that word with me before. It's a professional word, a word of respect, I'll call you next Sunday, not for a favor, just to hear your voice. We hung up. I didn't cry. I just went back to work. Boundaries aren't walls built out of hate. They are the lines we draw so that we can finally be seen. I am no longer the burden of Charlotte. I am the woman who changed the locks, not to keep them out, but to find myself within. If you are the reliable one in your family, the one who carries the weight while everyone else complains about the view, I have one final piece of advice for you. Thank yourself. Don't wait for them to notice. Don't wait for the Sunday dinner where everything becomes clear. Write your own receipt, build your own fence, and keep the key, because the only thank you that is ever on time is the one you give your own reflection. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey. This is Audrey Prescott, signing off from a life that is finally and completely mine. Subscribe for more stories, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself first. Nobody else is coming to do that job for you.